Convocation each fall to mark the official start of school. It is a time for us to come together and officially celebrate a new beginning. As we launch our 178th year as a school this evening, we participate in one of the many traditions and annual rites of passage that comprise the long and notable history of the school. Most of you know that the Williston Northampton School takes its name from two schools that merged in 1971. For boys, Williston Academy, and up the road, the Northampton School for Girls. The Angelus was presented to the Northampton School by the Student Council in 1952. Some say it became the heart of the Northampton School for Girls campus. The Angelus is a bell which on it is inscribed, "For Quiet Thought." It was sounded every afternoon, at which time students and teachers paused for a moment of silent reflection. Maria Bergie Dwight Levesconte, class of 1952, said at its dedication that the ringing of the Angelus was a call to remind us of the necessity of thought. There is much to think about in a brief moment of our own. Now permanently installed on the new residential quadrangle, it has become a tradition to sound the Angelus at Convocation and Commencement. As we sound the Angelus, I invite you to join me in a few moments of quiet thought. Thank you.
Guys, you look great. Thank you. Beautiful sunny day. You guys are all ready for pictures. I like this. So good afternoon and welcome, Williston students, especially the class of 2019, faculty, staff, and honored guests. Here we are at the end of our first week of Williston's 178th year. And so all of you have had a chance to sample classes, the afternoon program, and residential life. I think it takes at least 2 weeks to complete the re-entry from summer schedule and to get back into our routine. But in saying that, I hope that for each one of you, this year ahead is anything but routine. So in preparing my remarks for this afternoon, I did what Mrs. Sawyer invited us all to do the other day. I went to the Writing Center, searching for a topic, or at the very least a little inspiration. But Mrs. Sawyer turned me away. She was actually a little bit abrupt, telling me to get serious, come back when I had a first draft or an outline. I left feeling just a bit dissed. But then I thought, what would Mr. Korokowski and Mr. Talea say to me? They're right across the hall from my office. I could go to them for advice. I shared with Mr. Korokowski that I had read a couple of great novels this summer, but he gave me that stern-eyed dean's gaze look and said, "Stay away from fiction. Talk about something historical and relevant." So I slouched down to Mr. Talea's office, thinking that he would have the perfect advice. After all, he's like Obi-Wan Kenobi, and students are always making a pilgrimage to his office for advice. There he was, sitting on the floor of his office on a velvet cushion in the lotus position. And he said to me in a barely audible whisper, "What you say matters not, Mr. Headmaster. No one really listens." It's true, all but the cushion. Okay, well, I'm going to try anyway with this story. In the middle of the summer, I visited a Williston alumnus, an 86-year-old man who looked and acted as if he were about 20 years younger. He shook my hand with that kind of vice-like grip that I imagine Mr. Kearney uses in his strongman competitions when he log presses 400 pounds. Anyway, Mr. Palmer graduated from Williston in 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II. Think about that point in history. I asked Mr. Palmer how it happened that he came to Williston. He said, "My grandfather wanted me to take a postgraduate year before I went to Yale, just like he had done himself." Being a reader of history and an avid listener to stories told by older generations, my ears perked up, and I said, "Wait, Mr. Palmer, your grandfather graduated from Williston? What class was he in?" Mr. Palmer replied in a very matter-of-fact tone, "The class of 1869. Think about that point in history, 4 years after the Civil War ended. So Mr. Palmer, if he were here today, can tell any one of you stories that he remembers from his boyhood as told to him by his grandfather, stories about Williston during the Civil War. Galbraith was headmaster then. Last week during Welcome Days, I suggested to new students and their families that the best way to approach your Williston experience was to let your guard down, to be open to new things and meeting new people from backgrounds different from your own. So I'm going to follow my own advice and let my guard down for a minute and share with you a few broad strokes of my story in a way I hope you will do with one another. Like Mr. Palmer, I am a product of some very long-lived grandparents. My grandmother lived to be 102 years old, and she only passed away 5 years ago this coming October. She used to tell me stories of watching Babe Ruth play baseball for the Yankees when she was a girl growing up in New York City. My grandmother was the matriarch of the Jewish side of my family living in Charleston, South Carolina. I've kind of been following the storm situation down there. It's all good. My father, on the other hand, represents the WASP side of my family. That's where the Robert W. Hill III name comes in. I like to say that I'm bicultural, a product of Vermont and South Carolina, of Jewish ancestry on the one hand and of daughters of the American Revolution on the other. Both my northern father and my southern uncle served as junior officers in the U.S. Navy, and one of my favorite memories from my childhood was eating lunch in the officers' mess on a guided missile destroyer in Charleston Harbor. You should also know that my sister, who's only 14 months older than I am, is an expatriate who has spent her entire life since college living in Africa, where she now cares for her disabled adult daughter. These are just a few of the broad strokes of my story, but they say something about who I am, how I come to believe in the values that I hold. It should not be a surprise to you that because of my niece Jessica, I care deeply about disabled folks and their access to a good life. Or that given my Jewish relatives, that anti-Semitism in its historic form or contemporary expression tends to incite me. Or that I have an enduring admiration for those who serve in the United States military, particularly those who serve overseas. So here's my challenge. Each one of you can share similar stories from your still young lives, or from what you know of your own family's history. I urge you to let your guard down with one another and to share your stories, since that is the opening of meaningful relationships. It's the opening of lasting friendships, and it's the opening of building important communities. We are so lucky to be here, all of us, from 30 countries and 25 states. You might not recognize this in the moment, and I'm speaking to students specifically, but your Williston story has already begun. Some of you are being shaped by the giggles of Caroline Beaton or Addie Tyree, or by walking Miss Marsland's beautiful golden retrievers. All of you will be shaped by your teachers, advisors, coaches, every mentor you come to know, and they will become part of your story. It's my pleasure now to welcome Class President DJ Poulin from the class of 2019.
How's everyone doing? For those of you who don't know me, my name is Donald Poulin, but everyone calls me DJ. For today, there have been 177 convocations. It's a lot. Over the years, I'm sure Convocation has seen many topics discussed and many speeches made. I've been to 5 convocations myself, today being my 6th. I just feel honored to take part in today's proceedings. and I took writing this speech extremely seriously. As such, I revisited convocations of the past. I noticed that there are some similarities amongst them. One of these being the student speaker. You see, the student speakers always try to pass down some wisdom that they've learned to the students. And I too would like to pass down wisdom. Unfortunately for you, I have no wisdom. I don't know the secret to success, and I don't know the best way to live. To be honest, I don't even know when my bus leaves tomorrow. In fact, Coach, if you could remind me afterwards, that would be great. To be serious though, I won't stand up here and pretend I have all the answers. I will instead discuss something incredibly simple, something everybody knows, yet not everybody fully understands. And that is the importance of kindness. To quote Maya Angelou, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. When I think of all the people I've ever met, I don't think of how smart they are or how athletic they are. I think of how they treated me and how they treated others. Where's Vishnu? Where is he? There he is. Let me tell you something about Vishnu. He's one of the nicest guys you'll meet. He's always willing to lend a hand when you need one, and will always have something positive to say. Of course, he'll still give you a point if you're out after curfew. Still, no matter who you are, Vishnu treats you the same way. That's why in 10, 20 years, even if I never see him again, I'll still remember Vishnu as a good friend. So there's one way to be kind. Talk to everyone, whether you're a senior or a 7th grader, whether they're a boarder or a day student, whether they're a student or a teacher. Of course, it's not the only aspect of being kind. There are actually many. For now, though, let's focus on an easy one. Appreciate those around you. We all know that we're supposed to say please and thank you. We learned that long before high school. Yet at some point in time, some of us stopped saying it. Consider this a little reminder. Say please and thank you. It takes no effort whatsoever, and it shows you appreciate what has been done for you. Thank your peers when they do you a favor. Thank your teachers after class. Thank the dining staff when they bring out food. Thank the cars when they let you cross the street. And thank your parents, grandparents, whoever made it possible for you to come to Williston. Whenever someone does something for you, no matter how big or small, thank them. I'd like to take this moment to thank those of you who already do this. To those of you who don't say please and thank you, well, you know who you are, and frankly, I know who you are. Kindness seems easy, and it is, but it's also easy to forget when you have so much on your mind. At Williston and in life, you have a lot to think about and a lot to do. Here on this campus, you'll juggle academics and athletics, school life and social life. You'll study hard for that calculus test. You'll work hard out in the field to beat Deerfield. You'll go out with friends to relax a little. You'll take the SAT too many times. And all the while, you will almost definitely not get enough sleep. All I ask is that amidst all of these things, you don't forget how important just a bit of kindness is. You decide what this school is like. I know you've heard it a million times, but it's still true. If you're all kind, this will be a place that I'm glad you have gone to. I hope you will all do great things, but more so than that, I hope that you will all be great people. Thank you.
Thank you, DJ. I said it. One of the special traditions at Convocation is to honor faculty who have committed 25 years of their lives to Williston by presenting them with a Williston chair. This year we have one recipient, and there's some serendipity to his timing, as he is a classmate of our guest speaker. The Teller name is an indelible one at Williston, as both of Mr. Rick Teller's parents taught here. In fact, Mr. Teller's mother is the only person to have taught at the Northampton School for Girls, Williston Academy, and the Williston Northampton School. That's quite a feat. The Teller Chorus, which you sing in, is named in honor of our Mr. Teller's father. Mr. Rick Teller graduated from Williston in 1970 and then headed off to Vassar College. During his 25 years at Williston, he has held a number of positions, from teaching social studies to directing student activities. His love of music and photography are twin passions he pursues to this day, but we know him best as a librarian and as the school's archivist, known for his annual button speeches and the vast knowledge he holds of all things Williston. Please join me in thanking and congratulating Mr. Teller. We can deliver that. It is my true pleasure now to introduce a highly accomplished Williston storyteller, Charles Chick Egley, class of 1970. After graduating from Williston, Chick attended Yale, teaching there briefly after his graduation in 1974. He is an A-list writer, creator, editor, producer for any number of memorable television series, ones that I used to watch religiously before there was such a thing as binge watching on Netflix or Hulu. He worked on such hit series as NYPD Blue, LA Law. He was the executive producer of The Shield. Further, he has worked extensively with James Cameron and Stephen Bochco in a list of creative enterprises whose titles would all be familiar to you. To say that Mr. Egley's adult life has been defined by creating great stories would be an understatement. His current work finds him in New York City and Toronto, pushing creative boundaries as always. But I'll let him tell you his story, since there's no one better. Please join me in welcoming back to his alma mater, Mr. Chick Egley.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. It's a pleasure to be back. I want to thank the faculty, my friends Bill, the classmates Bill and Rick, Mr. Gregory, and you guys, the students. I was sitting in a class this afternoon. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me into your classrooms the last couple of days. And I was sitting in the journalism class today, just musing on how my 50th reunion is coming up, and I was struck by this one overwhelming thought as I looked around at the young faces in the room. And I thought, oh my God, I have socks older than these people. But anyway, you know, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and depending where you are and who you are, those famous words of Charles Dickens would ring true at just about any time, any point in human history. They certainly described the world during my time here at Williston in the late 1960s. It was the best of times because I was young and everything I was experiencing was brand new. It was the best of times because of the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, the brilliant autumn afternoons with foliage that seemed almost psychedelic. It was the best of times because I was falling in love for the first time. The friendships I was forging here at Williston and the discoveries I was making, one or two actually in a classroom. It was the worst of times because of the self-doubt that walks in lockstep with youth. Where do I fit into this world that wasn't making a whole lot of sense anyway? It was the worst of times because of the heartbreak that inevitably follows first love. I struggled with depression during my time here that only deepened in the bell jar of the dank New England, gray Massachusetts winters. And looming over all of it were the riots that were shredding our inner cities and the meat grinder of the Vietnam War, which steadily escalated throughout my 4 years here. The church bells in town would toll for every soldier from Massachusetts who was killed in battle. And at times it seemed as if the slow cadence of those bells would never stop. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I suspect you guys will look back at your years here and feel much the same way. Under BOT for short, you've got Kendrick Lamar. You got Travis Scott, Drake, Nicki, and yes, Cardi B. Really, after sober reflection, I have to admit, she is not without skills. Then, of course, there's falling in love, Instagram. You don't need me to lay it out for you. You already know what you got going on. But under WOT, can I just ask a show of hands, is anybody else starting to get sick of mumble trap yet? I mean, blase, 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 Lambo, you know? Then there's falling out of love, school shootings, and whatever your political persuasion, there's the ongoing clown show in the body politic. And throughout it all, by the grace of God and the robust financial support of parents and alumni, the Williston Northampton School endures. In some respects, everything's the same. Fort Hall, term papers, the Williston Pond, final exams, Mr. Gregory. Mr. Gregory, I am old. You, sir, are eternal. And in other respects, this school is mind-numbingly different. When my parents dropped me off in East Hampton freshman year, my father told me I wasn't coming here to fill my head with information, useless or otherwise, but to learn how to think. Along the way, I still managed to pick up a few factoids. Bucephalus was the name of Alexander the Great's horse. The writing on the wall of Belshazzar's feast was Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, and I have absolutely no idea what that means. And the principal parts of the irregular Latin verb meaning to bear, carry, suffer, or endure are fero fere, tuli latum. I want to put that out there. I was pretty sure I already had, kind of the general hang of knowing how to think. I mean, I did have to pass a test or two to get in here and fake my way through an interview and stuff. But what I did discover here at this school, it was teaching me how to organize my thinking. And of even greater consequence, it was opening me up to what to think about. In 1966, Williston Academy, as it was called then, wasn't a wildly diverse place. For starters, it was an all-boys school. So half of humanity was excluded from the academic experience. The more intuitive half, the half skilled at utilizing the entire brain instead of just the front part. Also, to its detriment, the school was not as diverse as it is today. But coming from a small town in Connecticut, Williston substantially broadened my horizons nonetheless. My freshman roommate was from Venezuela and spoke fluent Spanish. I developed friendships with kids from Liberia, Libya, Thailand, and Egypt. So at an early age, I learned that this great nation of ours exists in a whole world of nations. And that teenage boys are wired up pretty much the same wherever they come from. So it wasn't a leap to conclude, therefore, that people are pretty much the same everywhere, and they want the same things. They want to be safe, secure, loved, and respected. And that's a lesson that seems to have eluded a surprising number of people in our country these days who regard the other 7 billion of us as the problem. During my sophomore year, I took a religious studies class. It was held over there in the basement of the chapel. We had to write a term paper, something about the teachings of the New Testament in action or something like that. I picked up a book called Delano by John Gregory Dunn about the California grape boycott. I'd never heard of the town of Delano. I had never heard of John Gregory Dunn. I'd never heard of a labor dispute involving grapes. I reasoned that at only 225 pages, a book set in Surfing USA Cali Caliente about grapes wouldn't unduly tax my young mind. But what I discovered writing that paper was the heroic work that Cesar Chavez had been doing, fighting for the rights of Mexican migrant workers in the fields of the state responsible for 13% of the total agricultural output of the United States. And despite their enormous contribution, these people were being systematically exploited because of their ethnicity. And that paper, my sophomore year, was my introduction to a political struggle that would frame the social dynamic in a place that I would end up calling home for really the next 50 years and still counting. And what I learned in that classroom would also prefigure much of the political turmoil over immigration roiling our nation still. Now, Barry Moser was my art history class, and he taught us that the role of the artist was to show the rest of us how to see the world in a new way. Our assignment in the class, therefore, was to go out and look for something we had never seen before. Now, without missing a beat, the comedian sitting next to me stared at me, pointed to my face, and said, "I believe that's a new zit I have not seen before." So his assignment complete, he stood up, announced he was heading back to the dorm to blaze up and listen to the new Doors album that had just dropped. But Mr. Mosier offered a tight smile and said this was, in fact, a serious assignment that would factor heavily into our final grade, so off we went to discover that one detail in God's creation that had so far eluded us in our 17 years of existence. Now, as you might have guessed, that exercise didn't yield any benzene ring level discoveries. For my part, I noticed during a winter rain that afternoon that the raindrops falling into Williston Pond remained discrete and intact for a split second before being absorbed, probably because of the surface tension. A eureka moment that was far less colorful than the comedian who returned with the discovery that the guy driving the Zamboni down at the Lasone rink had a birthmark in the middle of his bald spot that was in the shape of Peru. The point of the exercise, Mr. Mosier elucidated, was less about what we saw than about adopting an attitude of looking at the world with greater acuity, being alert to details we might otherwise look past, learning to see with fresh eyes. A skill that he suggested would have broad application in all areas of our lives. Now, I realized in writing this that in today's parlance, Mr. Mosier was in essence asking us to stay woke. But one of the most important things at Williston that I picked up wasn't in the classroom. This fine old school, as Phil Stevens, our then headmaster, used to call it, wasn't a rigid environment, but it wasn't exactly the Woodstock Nation either. Jackets and ties were mandatory, no long hair, which, if you can believe it, I found especially onerous. There's mandatory chapel and all of that stuff. But on May 4th, 1970, 4 students at Kent State were killed by the Ohio National Guard during an anti-war protest on campus. Sadly, nowadays, in an era of when school shootings are as common as clay, that would be celebrated as a low body count, but it was like a bomb going off on this campus. The roar of the B-52s flying out of Westover Air Force Base and the tolling of the church bells had long since become a part of the fabric of everyday life. But to most of the students here, many of draft age or approaching it, those 4 dead college kids brought the war home. The next morning, a significant number of us skipped class and met over there in the chapel. And there was a general consensus that we had to do something, otherwise our silence would be consent, as one of the slogans of the day chided. So we decided that we were going to leave campus and protest and walk the 5 miles to Northampton to join one of the many demonstrations that were taking place in the 5 college area. But we would be doing so without permission. In fact, the headmaster specifically ordered us back to our classrooms, confronting each of us with what seemed like the biggest decision in our young lives. We were all making furious calls to the colleges we'd already been accepted to. Would those acceptances be withdrawn if we got kicked out of school? Everything we'd worked so hard for 4 long years, it really hung in the balance. The headmaster stood his ground, and we streamed past nonetheless. On our way to Northampton in violation of the rules of this fine old school, rules that gave structure and organization to this institution where we were learning the mastery of critical thought. But it was on that day that I learned about another attribute at work in this place. It had been there all along. I just hadn't mustered the requisite alertness to see it. It was emotional reason. As I would later come to understand the term, Phil Stevens didn't march back to his office and fire off stern letters to our parents informing them that all that tuition they'd been shelling out for 4 years for their little angels had just gone down the drain. No, if he couldn't stop the march, stop our protest, he would lead it. Now, I have no idea what Phil Stevens' politics were. But there he was, single file, boys, single file, nicely now, nicely. He was looking out for the safety of the students, of course, but he was also affirming the commitment he saw in our young faces, opposed to a war that we could find no justification for. Now, to be sure, the old guard on the faculty registered their strong disapproval, especially when our protests were followed by teach-ins on campus about Southeast Asia, held right here. We were talking about neo-colonialism and the underlying causes of the conflict, and change for the sake of change, they grumbled, this fine old school was going to hell in a handbasket. Well, in fact, it was anything but. It was emotional reason embedded in the very fiber of this fine old school that allowed it to continue to evolve and grow. It was only a year or so after my graduation that Williston underwent a profound transformation, which occasioned a radical improvement in the quality of the academic environment. Coeducation. Just one of the many dramatic changes that continue to make this fine old school finer still. But now you're probably asking yourself, did old dude just blow in from Cali to drag the rest of us down his memory lane? Back when he and Rick Teller wrote term papers by whale oil lamps, dreaming of one day being allowed to grow their ponytails. Well, I was aware there might be some expectation that I should perhaps offer some insight into the contemporary zeitgeist that might be useful to you folks. So, back when I was a student during the age of Aquarius, the single biggest technological advance that had most altered the course of history until that point was not the bomb or television, it was Gutenberg's printing press, which had facilitated the dissemination of empirical knowledge, causing individual insight and scientific study to supplant religious doctrine, thereby ushering in the age of reason. Since then, the arrival of the internet has allowed access to quite literally unlimited information, giving name to our current epoch. A good thing, right? Yeah, most assuredly. But the benefits of this revolution in technology come at a price with a potentially perilous downside. In the June issue of The Atlantic, Henry Kissinger, of all people, I mean, because this guy was the regnant boogeyman of my youth here, wrote that the internet's purpose is to ratify knowledge through the accumulation and manipulation of ever-expanding data. Accumulation and manipulation of data. Now think about that for a second. The emphasis is no longer on conceptualizing or contextualizing meaning. We're witnessing a shift away from interrogating history and philosophy. And I'm paraphrasing Dr. Kissinger here again. Instead, we seek information relevant to our immediate practical need. In the process, search engine algorithms predict the results we seek, returning data pre-selected to comport with the premise that we're in effect being guided to. As a consequence, critical and analytical skills begin to atrophy. Original thinking, the creative voice inside each of us, runs the risk of going the way of the auto mechanic. You know, when you take your car to a shop now, they hook it up to a computer, and that gives a readout showing what parts need to be replaced, what's not working. But it's very cost convenient and efficient, but trying to find someone who actually knows how a car works, how the various systems function, with the skill set to ascertain the cause of whatever is broken down and the ability to repair it, a mechanic in other words, has been superseded by a parts replacer. Now, most of us don't know how to shoe a horse either, because it's information that's no longer essential to how we live our lives. So maybe the skills involved in critical analysis are no longer necessary. Possibility? Just as the Enlightenment was coming into full flower, the most unenlightened of all practices, the enslavement of one human being by another, emerged in all its horror as a potent force in international trade when Queen Elizabeth I issued the charter for the Royal Africa Company. At the time of our nation's following, 2 centuries later, the routinized savagery of slavery had elevated what otherwise would have been a peasant economy in the American colonies to a lucrative financial empire with global reach, accomplished by means of stolen labor from millions of African Americans through bloodshed, torture, and unspeakable terror. Now you're thinking, didn't he just say he was going to talk about this zeitgeist, as in the here and now? What does any of this have to do with us? And my answer to you is it has everything to do with you. America was the first nation in the history of the world, is the first nation, to be founded on an idea. It's not blood and soil, it's not tribal or religious affiliation. The country was founded on this idea of we the people, around the spiritual principle that all men are created equal, with certain unalienable rights. Now, Jefferson's aspirational language in the Declaration was undercut to the point of contradiction, however, when it came to the fiscal demands of this bold experiment in self-governance. The 3/5 compromise enshrined in the new republic that African American slaves did not count as a whole person in the census, used to bolster the voting power of the slave states. In fact, in the eyes of the law, they weren't regarded as people at all. They were property. And for the record, women of any color weren't accorded any of these unalienable rights either. You're wondering, wasn't all of this resolved 13 years ago in a civil war? Well, consider, if you will, an algorithm selecting for the spiritual principle of justice for all, but weighted in favor of a material necessity that ensures that the rights of some members of our society are more unalienable than others. Hit search, and the results you will get is the society we're living in right now. America's original sin looms over us still. In theory, we're all equal before the law. In practice, however, our experience too often is informed by the color of our skin or the financial resources at our disposal. Okay, America still has some work to do, not a news flash, but aren't things better than when you were here, Chick? Well, yes, in some ways. Others, not so much. It's a well-settled political tradition in this country to disavow racism, then go to the ballot box and vote for a broad agenda of discrimination. When people become fearful, they're especially susceptible to selling out their spiritual principles to shore up their material security, just as our founding fathers did. At a time when we're more inclined to accumulate and manipulate data than to interrogate it, this propensity of ours, this human frailty, takes on a dire urgency. In the last election, a majority of white voters backed the least racist person you've ever met, who explicitly pledged to use the power of the state against people of color and religious minorities. A promise made and a promise unfortunately kept. Now, please don't think I'm just another coastal elitist that's banging on this particular administration. They're just selling a new version of the old saw that gave us the Clinton crime bill, Bill's throwdown with Sister Souljah, and Willie Horton. Though I will say this current regime is the most unadulterated version I've seen since George Wallace. But the problem is so much greater than just one man or one party. Whether the issue is prison reform, financial regulation, medical care, voters' rights, education, the list goes on and on and on. The solutions that we select for do not favor the interests of minorities, and most of the time the disenfranchised end up getting blamed for being disenfranchised. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, consider Dr. Kissinger's observation, and again I'm going to paraphrase. Inundated with opinions on blast from social media, we're diverted from introspection, weakening our fortitude to develop convictions forged by traveling the lonely road, which is an intellectual journey that is the very essence of creativity. And it's the antithesis of these cyber constituencies that get all ginned up by half-truths and ghost stories that now pass as our civil discourse. We've become siloed off into echo chambers of partisan belief, no longer tested by rigorous debate. Without debate, there's no consensus. So not only does truth become relative, truth is whatever's trending. And as long as we're cocooned away behind barricades of self-justification against some fictional other that we've created, we will fail in our attempts to form a more perfect union. And this is where you guys come in, because you hold the key to ensuring that that doesn't happen. Some thoughts on how to accomplish that. Consider for a moment that the solutions necessary to achieve social justice might not be found in cyberspace. Instead, it's in here, in each one of you, or in the heart of the person sitting next to you. Instead of reaching for the keyboard to stave off loneliness, try embracing solitude. You might discover that the answers you're seeking can be found in the silence rather than the cacophony of social media. Instead of looking for affirmation in the things you know or think you know, give yourself the assignment to actually go look for something new in your experience, something you've never seen before. Now, let me hasten to add here, I am not a Luddite, and I'm not urging you to become one either. There's no better America to go back to, even if you could. Time moves in one direction. Imua is the Hawaiian word for it, forward. So be critical of your examination of ideas and creative in your search for solutions. And please do not be afraid of failure. From my own experience, I can tell you it's a far better teacher than success. I know that sounds counterintuitive because everything about our culture teaches us it's better to win. But next time you find yourself in an argument with someone, and this works especially well if it's somebody that you actually don't like, try listening to them. I mean, really hear what they're saying. Accept them right where they are and support them in their belief. And I don't mean to shine them on cynically. And you don't have to agree with them, but just sit with their point of view as an exercise. I think you'll find that you might reach consensus a whole lot sooner than by demolishing them with those potent rhetorical skills that you're learning here. You'd be surprised, really, how often being right about something ends up being the booby prize. Now, I was studying for final exams in December 1969, my senior year here at Williston, on the day that Jay-Z was born. Decades later, I would read his musings on hip-hop and life in his autobiography, Decoded. Young Hova wrote, "Flow is like a heartbeat or the way you breathe. It can speed up or slow down. It can stop or pound right through like a machine. If the beat is time, then flow is what we do with that time, how we live through it. The beat is everywhere, but every life has to find its own flow." I began to find mine here on this campus and in these mean streets of East Hampton. It was a good start. I was very fortunate. So are all of you. Good luck. Imua.
Thank you, Mr. Egley. I met Chick a couple times out in his home turf in California, and I knew he was an expert on hip-hop music. Those references are not just throwaways, so if you want to get into it with him, go ahead. I also know that he's got more Air Jordans that you guys could ever hope for, 1 through 13 of the retros, and he renews that all the time, so you can check that out as well. And now I know that he's a great storyteller of the American experiment, so I'm going to make sure we get a copy of that posted, because I'll need to go back to that as well. It's chock full of insights. Public announcement here, we will ask Mr. Mann to come up and lead us with the alma mater, and then we will recess out, the faculty that is, will recess out the way we came in, so wait for us where you are after the singing. Seniors will be having dinner down in the dining commons. Everyone else, there's a tablecloth banquet down in the gym. A lot of work has gone into this. You guys are a great audience. It's going to be a fantastic year. Mr. Mann.